Please, we have two more very distinguished speakers here to speak about the topic. We're running a little bit behind time, as we almost always do, so I'm not going to spend too much time introducing our speakers. They need no introduction, really. The first speaker of our next session is Professor Bergland Youngman. I probably mispronounced it, even though I've been practicing from UCLA.
Thank you very much. Your pronunciation was perfect. How do I move forward and backward? Is it? Oh, it's down here. Okay, thank you. Sorry. This is the microphone I should speak in. Maybe that's better, yes. Thank you all for coming, and thank you. It's an honor to speak at this symposium with my very distinguished colleagues from Korea and also from here. So I'm going to talk about some characteristics and peculiarities of commemorative painting of the Joseon dynasty, to which Uige, of course, belong. The very special genre of visual representation of Uige, Uige-do, and so I'm talking more on the side products, so to speak, on the paintings that resulted from the events and also the compilation of Uige, which I think is a very, very special genre only found in Korea. This has been thoroughly explored, as you have already seen by my distinguished colleagues, Professors Lee Sung-mi and Park Jong-hae, who have done the most extensive and in-depth research on both the existing visual and textual material. I would like to use my role as someone who is lesser acquainted with all the details and aspects of the material, my outsider role, so to speak, to raise some issues that distinguish this genre from the context of Joseon court painting and of East Asian conventions as a whole. Uige-do are a type of documentary painting, or kirokwa. That is, they were produced as a document of a certain event that was to be commemorated, and this character of documentation and commemoration was in fact the reason why we still have a fairly large body of such works. Rather than being collected as objects of art, Uige-do were kept as records, just like historical texts. I would therefore like to extend the scope of my investigation a little and include other documentary paintings done for the purpose of commemoration, which are not necessarily linked to Uige records, but share similar characteristics and peculiarities. Let me first introduce some of the different types, formats, and contents of commemorative paintings and the context of their creation. From there, I would like to move on to the question of peculiarities and conventions of Uige-do, which in my mind can only have been developed within a certain framework of agency and function that was particular for the Joseon court. So I'm going to show you some older paintings, which we call keido, or paintings of gatherings of high officials, which are somewhat similar, especially in their relationship between text and image. In most cases, the common characteristic element which allows us to group keido and Uige-do into the genre of documentary or commemorative painting. And the most important part of all these works is the list of names and titles of high officials attached to the painting, which you can, of course, see at the bottom of each of these paintings. Although the correspondence between text and image is a long-held tradition in East Asian painting, the case of Joseon commemorative painting is particular in that we do not have a poetic but a bureaucratic text here. In the case of hanging scrolls, the list is placed underneath the painting on screens, and here you have one early screen of a similar kind. It is placed on the last panel, which is on the right. And this is the gathering of elders of Forgwon Tae-un, a high official dated in 1969. And I have a later example here at the Los Angeles County Museum. This is a banquet to Ugedo for Queen Dowager Shinjong in 1868. We also have horizontal scrolls, such as Hanshigak's special national examination for applicants of northeastern provinces, from the northeastern provinces. This also has a title actually written. It starts on the right-hand upper side with a title which I don't have in my screen, and then what follows is this. So it has a long list of people there. And we have another format, the album, but I'm not going to show you examples of that because then I would go over time. If we do not have any other textual information, these lists provide us with the names of the most important people involved in the event. In the case of gathering of high officials, we can be quite certain that the actual participants are listed. Since most of them had some standing in society and their biographies are known in some detail, these lists allow us to roughly date the painting when comparing their titles and the offices they worked in. For court events that required special ceremonials, such as the birthday banquet for a queen, Uge give us much more information, as we have already heard. For instance, dates and details of the preparation, the offices and people involved, including the name of court painters. Most interestingly, and Professor Park has also demonstrated that already, Uge also contain illustrations of the place of the event and of details such as the garments of participants and the decoration used, or the dances performed. I'm showing you woodblock printed illustrations from Mujin Jinchan Uge, the ceremonial record for banquet of the year Mujin, which is the banquet for Queen Dowager Shinjong, which directly corresponds to the screen at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, as you can see here. An illustration of Gangmyeonjeon, the hall in which the event took place, that is at Gyeongbokgung, shortly after its restoration in the late 19th century. And then there are, of course, also these images of flower arrangement, musical instruments, dances performed, and so on. As in the case of the gatherings, one might expect that all the participants were listed, but this is not the case. The highest member of the royal family, Queen Dowager Shinjong herself, King Kojong and his father Hungson Taewongun are not mentioned. It is rather the list rather provides us with the names and titles and offices of the highest officials who were in charge of organizing the ceremonies. And again, you have these two correspondences between the Uge and the screen. The screen, by the way, and that's interesting, it doesn't give us the day. You can see that. So we know we have several screens, and apparently this was kept open for some reason because it wasn't decided yet. The extant screens recording a much more important event in Choson history, King Cheongjo's visit to the city of Hwasong, which you have also already seen, in 1795, does not provide this kind of list, but we do have a corresponding Uge, the Wanheng Ulmyo Chungni Uge, which Professor Park has introduced, that gives information on the participants, the individual festivities, and the painters. Usually a certain number of such screens of different sizes were produced to be distributed. So these are the four right-hand side, the last panels, and these are the first four. That's another version, by the way. Professor Park had the version from the Lium in Seoul, and this is from the Usually a certain number of screens of different sizes were produced to be distributed to various government offices and individuals. Therefore, several similar screens and also some separate panels, fragments of whole screens, are extant of this. Thus, apart from the close link between text and image, there are two other important characteristics of Joseon commemorative painting: the production of multiple copies and the collaboration of court painters. There are also different types of commemorative paintings in terms of content. Some of them show the actual scene, and now we come back to these early gathering paintings. Others relate to the event in a more elusive way, by showing ideal landscapes. For the paintings of Keihedo, or gathering of high officials, I'm showing you again these two early hanging scrolls, the gathering of government officials at the Fern Court and gathering in the Hall of Literary Studies. In the hanging scroll on the right, we can see the Hall of Literary Studies, Toksodang, on the banks of the Han River. Professor E has lectured on this, and she has photographs of how it looks now. There are apartment buildings, of course. We are at the shore of the Han River, so at that point we had nice forests and a landscape there. In the hanging scroll, in contrast, the landscape on the left does not exist, but the scroll shows a generic composition following the style of the famous 15th century court painter Angyeon, a formula that was very popular in the 16th century. As examples of Ugedo, we have already seen the royal visit to Hwasong and the banquet screen of Queen Dowager Shinjong as representations of the real event, and there are many other examples. But in contrast, there's also King Gyeongjo's trip to Onyang for a hot spring cure in 1667, although I'm not sure we have an Ige for that, but it's a role involving the king, which strongly reminds us of the compositions based on the Tang painter Wang Wei's Wangchuan Villa. That's an old theme which has a tradition in China and also in Korea. Another example is King Gyeongjong's selection of government officials in 1721. This is an interesting painting because it relates to a real event, as the list of participants proves, but bears a theme rooted in Chinese tradition and popular all over East Asia, and that is the gathering of the Orchid Pavilion, or Lanting, of the famous Chinese calligrapher Wang Xizhi in the early 4th century, and his friends celebrating a spring festival. It follows the familiar iconography, with most of the participants sitting alongside a stream and playing a drinking game of floating cups. You see these people sitting around this stream there. In the pavilion on the right, we usually find Wang Xizhi himself watching the scene from an elevated position. Here, however, and this is quite curious, the seat in the pavilion is empty. I'm not sure whether you see that well. Unfortunately, it's difficult to get a good illustration of this screen. A peculiarity, sorry, I'm not a native speaker sometimes, to which I will come back later. Another interesting detail is the simple depiction of a hall on the first panel, which apparently represents the place of the event. There are tiny figures placed in the hall, a detail which is unfortunately difficult to see here. It appears as if in both types of commemorative paintings, those of gathering of high officials and those of events involving the royal family, we can find both ideal and real scenes. In this respect, the screen of gathering of elders of Gwantaeun, which I have shown you a little earlier, dating 1690, is particularly important because it amalgamates both types of iconography. Whereas we see Guan Te-un and the other participants sitting together in a pavilion in the middle, as if it were the real place, their surroundings resemble that of a fairyland. We see a Chinese garden setting with a terrace embraced by a carved balustrade, garden rocks with peonies, a banana tree, and female servants clad in Chinese costume. From this, several questions arise. Was the choice between the real and the ideal scene for a commemorative painting a free, random choice of the person who commissioned the painting? Or was it governed by the purpose of the screen? Or do we have a certain development over time, for instance, from paintings that show ideal scenes to those of real scenes? Our examples of ideal and mixed scenes date mostly from the 17th and early 18th century, whereas the depiction of real scenes seems to have gained more ground in the late 18th through early 20th century. An interesting case showing that very different kinds of screens can relate to the same event are screens commissioned in relation to the illness and recovery of a crown prince, later to become Emperor Sunjong. He contracted smallpox in late 1879. Two extant screens, one of these, this is at Koryo-daekyo Pangulgwan, the Museum of Korea University, show the event in the familiar format of a court documentary, similar to the other screens, such as the banquet for Queen Dowager Xinzong. There is another screen of 10 symbols of longevity, which is also linked to this event. The two documentary screens were created for the official celebration of the Crown Prince's recovery in 1879. They give a record of the event, list a group of high court officials, and show the tiny throne of the 5-year-old prince. And I think I have blow up here, who is, of course, invisible in front of a screen of the 10 symbols of longevity. And then we have a 10 symbols screen, a screen of the 10 symbols of longevity, again with a list of officials, which can be dated to 1880. The physicians commissioned it in commemoration of their own successful work. Due to the research done by art historian Park Bun-soo, we know that the Queen sponsored several celebrations, but it is unclear whether she commissioned the screen in order to thank the doctors or whether they themselves were the patrons of the screen. Let me summarize the characteristics of Joseon commemorative paintings seen so far before I start to look at more peculiar aspects. They were commissioned from early on by groups of high officials privately or in their official functions as documents to commemorate certain events in their lives. These documents were kept in the family in order to demonstrate the high standing of a family member to later generations. We have indeed more evidence of commemorative paintings of the early Joseon period, a period of which a vast amount of visual material has been lost, than of other painting genres due to the importance they were given within the social structure that emphasized the lineage and the close relationship between education and high social standing. Even when it comes to proper ugedo, such as the screen for Queen Dowager Xinzong's 60th birthday, the screen gives evidence of the high officials who were involved rather than focusing on the person who is honored. This is, of course, another indication of how strong bureaucrats were at the Joseon court. The documentary character of these scrolls and screens also overwhelms the art character of the painting. We seldom find evidence of the painters who produced the painting, and the set iconographies and restricted court style leave little room for any individual traces of the artist's brushes. Like other large court projects, commemorative paintings were done in collaboration. In another study, I have emphasized the extremely low standing of court painters within the official hierarchy. From the beginning of the dynasty, they were just regarded as craftsmen and were poorly paid. They came under attack by censorate officials whenever a king wanted to promote his favorite painter to a higher office. Apart from their low standing, the overall the overall appreciation of painting was also low, because the Confucian concept of the hierarchy of the arts, in this concept, paintings ranged at the bottom, lower than philosophical writing, poetry, and calligraphy. The preference of text over image, writing over visual representation is felt in many of these works. This finally brings me to the discussion of some visual peculiarities of Joseon commemorative painting. When I did research on the banquet of Queen Dowager Shinjong at Lakme a few years ago, I found some very odd aspects. First, the uneven composition. Second, the diagrammatic layout of the celebrations. And third, the uniconic representation of certain participants. None of these three characteristics seem to make sense in a visual representation of the screen format. Sorry. As for the first, the uneven composition. Of the three celebrations, two are spread out on 2 panels each, whereas the third occupies 3 panels. The second celebration in the middle is the actual birthday party for the queen. It took place in the same hall, the king's residence at Gyeongbok Palace, Gangneonjeon, as these two are in the same hall, these two. Gangneonjeon, and then, wait a minute. Yes, and the third one is a reception of the king for the high officials who had been in charge of the events. The actual birthday party, and the only of the three events in which Queen Shinjong herself was present, thus occupies less space than the celebration for the officials on the left. Moreover, the hall on the left appears much larger than the one shown in the first scene on the right, which is Kunjeongjeon, the throne hall. But in reality, Kunjeongjeon, of course, is much larger than Gangneonjeon. This confirms what the list already indicates, that the officials are the agents behind the project, considering themselves more important than the queen, even more important than the king, it seems, whose throne hall should have been the largest building on the screen, both for its actual size and for its importance for the kingdom. Second, the diagrammatic layout of the scenes is another peculiar visual effect. Because it collides with the function of a screen. The small figures and their position can only be appreciated from close by. Thus, such configurations make sense for an album or a hand scroll, but less for a hanging scroll and even lesser for a screen, because both are usually appreciated from a certain distance. A good example of a successful visual effect to be appreciated from afar was the screen of the 10 symbols of longevity, which I showed you before, and even more so the screens of the sun, moon, and 5 peaks behind the throne, of which you see an example here, which are placed behind the king's throne. Moreover, as document, the screen format does not make sense either, because a screen is much more difficult to store than any scroll or album. An old photograph gives evidence, however, that such banquet screens were indeed used as decorative backdrops. And you see that in a photograph, which I took from Professor Park's book. Hence, we may assume that these screens were made for display. We have already discussed the close relationship between the Yuge illustrations and representations on the screen, but that alone cannot be the solution to the problem. Any other representation would have been possible and more successful, unless the viewers had another interest, that of finding their place within a social diagram. Historical research has demonstrated that Joseon Confucian scholars followed in the footsteps of their Song dynasty idols in explaining matters of the world and the cosmos in diagrams, at a time when this form had already actually abandoned in China. It started out in the Joseon period in Korea. And I have just two examples here, one from Yi Huang's writings, and this is an explanation of Zhou Dunyi, who was a Song Dynasty scholar, the Taititu, and another one taken from an Uyghur. So I think this idea of a diagram plays an important role behind the configurations we find on these Uyghur. The third rather interesting characteristic or peculiarity is the absence of some of these people in the screens, the uniconic representation of certain participants. Interestingly, these phantom participants, the king, regent, queen, and other female members of the royal family, and the wives of high officials, belong to different groups in society, different in gender and social standing, and thus their non-appearance must have different reasons. The uniconic representation of the king, the empty throne in front of this screen of sun, moon, and 5 peaks, is particularly intriguing if compared to Chinese commemorative paintings. For instance, here you see a detail of Emperor Tianlong from Yao and Han's court painters painting an imperial banquet at Ziguang Hall. Qing emperors proudly presented themselves to the public on such commemorative scrolls and on portraits. Here you have a wonderful portrait of Tianlong by one of his Jesuit painters, Lang Shening, or Giuseppe Castiglione, an Italian priest painter. So they were proudly shown to the public. As Professor Yi Song-mi has demonstrated in an article, the production, transport, and installment of king's portraits in Joseon, Korea, were also recorded in Uyghur, a clear indication on the sacredness of these paintings in the Joseon concept of kingdom and rulership. There's a large difference between the two, obviously. The uniconic representation of the king can be understood in the same way. The king was sacred, the mediator between the realm of his rulership and heaven, and thus it was inappropriate to show him together with ordinary people. This explains, of course, the empty seat in the painting of King Gyeongjong's selection of government officials in 1721. The Joseon concept does, however, not apply to the Chinese point of view, which is also quite interesting, onto Joseon. Hence, a Chinese artist, Cheng Yu, depicted King Yongzhou receiving a communique of the Qing Emperor in an album of 1725 on the occasion of the visit of a Qing envoy, Akedun, to the Joseon court. And you can see this is Yongzhou, and this is the Chinese envoy here. So we have to have a documentary painting with a Korean king. Since the envoy represents the Qing emperor, he's even slightly larger than the king. The absence of female members of the royal house and other ladies, and they are depicted here. Yes, I'm almost there. And they are depicted here by empty cushions in the upper right corner. This is again a detail from the LACMA screen. Ladies of high standing, this cannot be explained in the same manner as that of the ruler. The visual absence can only be explained by the strict Confucian laws of women's chastity. And I've just given you a detail of a screen attributed to Kim Hong-do in the Musée Guimet in Paris, where you have, of course, have a woman who's covering her head while on the road. All of the characteristics and peculiarities investigated so far point to a genre that drew from various sources, textual and visual, combining contemporaneous Joseon circumstances with ideals of Chinese antiquity. It was carefully constructed to suit the philosophical and political concepts of elite government officials. All of these sources discussed so far were rooted in East Asian visual concepts. But could there also be a connection with ideas and visual concepts coming from Europe? In the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, about which we have heard a lot today, in Paris, there is a painting of a Catholic ceremony which has striking similarities with late Joseon commemorative paintings. In his recent research, art historian Lianming Wang identifies it as the procession of the Feast of the Sacred Heart in front of the Beitang Church, which is the northern cathedral. The southern cathedral in Beijing was more well known, but this is another Jesuit church there. It's done on Korean paper by an anonymous Chinese painter, probably in the 1760s. The symmetrical composition arranged alongside a central axis. I think I won't go through the whole description here. You see that there are some similarities, and I'm putting these side by side here. Dr. Wang has demonstrated in his research that the proportions of the figures, although we have a little bit more of a kind of a perspective involved here than there, it's quite similar. And Dr. Wang has demonstrated in his research the proportions of the figures, buildings, and trees are not they do not quite match in terms of distance. He therefore deduces that rather than one of the Jesuit painters of the Qing court, one or more Chinese painters working outside the court produced this painting. According to him, illustrations in Catholic books translated into Chinese might have been an inspiration, and this is John the Baptist was born prior to the birth of the Lord of Heaven, which translate into Chinese, I'll try it, Sheng Yuehan Xian Tianzhu Eryun, done in the 17th century by Giulio Aleni. And here we have a similar arrangement, again, of courtyards in much more of a linear perspective. And, of course, the figures in the foreground also emphasize the spatial depth. However, another source of inspiration might have been other traditions closer to home. A Buddhist painting of the early Joseon dynasty depicting scenes of life of the Buddha uses similar devices of perspective. I won't go into the similarities and differences, but an interesting common characteristic of all these paintings is that they all show simultaneous scenes that happened consecutively in time. This is true to the life of Prince Siddhartha, who became Buddha Shakyamuni, the ceremonies at the Catholic Church in Beijing, but also to the dances performed in front of the king, the regent, and high officials in such banquet screens. And yes, we have that here. Let me see, that was the last one. We know that Joseon envoys sought the acquaintance of Jesuit priests at the Qing court, so they might have been able to see such paintings and books I have shown you. And even court painters who traveled to Beijing might have made sketches of such works. But we see that there are also East Asian traditions on which Joseon court painters might have built. And for the moment, rather than arguing for a close relationship between any of these examples, I would like to opt for inspiration from different models, much like the drawing of on various textual and visual sources in my earlier discussions of text and image, that led to the development of a new and unique genre of Joseon painting. What is most interesting, however, is the fact that the comparative examples are all religious paintings. Together with the uniconic representation of figures, also a device that can usually be found only in religious painting, it shows that Confucian ideas of court ceremonies were conducted and commemorated with religious enthusiasm. Uigedo give evidence of the extremely influential role of high government officials at the Joseon court, which is not really new to historians, I think. This is demonstrated by the strong relationship between bureaucratic text and image and the recording of their names. They decided the schedule and the procedure of the ceremonies, oversaw the compilation of ige and the production of ige-do. It is also most likely that the visual representation of gatherings of high officials, kehedo, set the stage for the emergence of ige-do. However, we also sense an agency on the part of the court painters who were able to draw from multiple traditions, themes of Chinese antiquity, diagrammatic representation deriving from cosmology, and possibly European-inspired Chinese illustrations and native religious work. Thank you very much.